Well, it's a pleasure to be with you all today. And is Stephen Ward here yet? I was going to introduce him. Charles mentioned him at the start of the program. Stephen's my older brother. I followed him to Hampton from Los Angeles, where we grew up, and he followed me at the University of Michigan. And I'm glad that Nova Boyd's here. I wasn't only her teaching assistant, but she's a dear friend and mentor of mine. And that's a pleasure to see her. So thank you, Charles, for that introduction, and thank you to you and Carla Lockhart for inviting me and organizing my visit. And I want to also thank Chris Everett again for this important film, very important, powerful film that is personally very meaningful to me, aside from its relationship to the work that I do that Charles mentioned. Personally meaningful to me because, as I'll share in a moment, it's in part my own family story. But I want to say first that what's important about Chris's film to me at this time, at this moment in our history, is that it puts before us in one of the most compelling ways possible, that is through the visual power, the audio power, the emotional power of film, the importance of us reckoning with the incredible racial violence in American history and its legacies today. I've been sort of driven by this understanding in much of my work, and I first became aware of this need to deal with the legacies of racial violence in conducting this research on the racial history of juvenile justice, which resulted in the book, The Black Child Savers. The Black Child Savers are the predominantly black women who began organizing, coincidentally or not, in 1898 against the Jim Crow juvenile justice system that was beginning to take shape across the country. They organized predominantly in the South initially, became a national movement eventually. But they organized against what they considered an institution, a genocidal institution. And they used the term genocide very explicitly because they saw this system being organized to, quote, kill the seeds of a people. Kill the seeds of a people by systematically underdeveloping the human potential of a select group, by underdeveloping the cognitive ability, the spiritual well-being, the mental health, the economic, political prospects. Beginning in childhood, you effectively ensure that the group collectively will have diminished prospects for participation in social life and diminished prospects for mobility. So I became interested in that in the context of doing that work that started actually at the University of Michigan in a dissertation project and then culminated years later in the book. And after that work, I began to look more broadly at the history of racial violence and its legacy beyond this context of juvenile justice. How should we think about the sort of transgenerational trauma of historical racial violence, and what are the implications for remedy? In his final speech to the nation, our past president, former President Obama, made an interesting comment where he challenged specifically white Americans to acknowledge that the effects of slavery and Jim Crow did not end in the 1960s. And it's an important challenge, but I think he could have issued that challenge more widely. I think all of us need to do more to first acknowledge that reality, but also, and I think more importantly, we have to do a lot more to understand exactly what those effects are. What are the effects that we continue to live with from slavery and Jim Crow? And I know that there are people who have been thinking about this and writing about this for some time, but I think that depth of reckoning that is needed is sorely lacking. So what I'd hope to accomplish today in my remarks is to give you some perspective on what we're learning from at least the social science realm about what some of those effects are today, and what the implications are for remedy. As I mentioned, this is in part for me a personal story. And I want to stress, I only learned of this personal family connection rather recently. Some of what I'm going to say right now, I only learned this week about my family history in Wilmington. So I was already doing this work. I had already published The Slow Violence of State Organized Race Crime and other pieces on legacies of racial violence before learning that several of my African American ancestors lived in Wilmington, North Carolina in the 1880s, a place that was for a moment regarded as the most progressive city in the most post-emancipation South, owing to its racially integrated neighborhoods, its remarkable levels of economic and political equality before the 1898 massacre and coup. My ancestors owned their own businesses. They owned considerable property in Wilmington. They held public office, serving in the state legislature and municipal government. In the film, Untitled says there were no blacks from Wilmington in the House of Representatives. Not true. Two of my ancestors were in the North Carolina House of Representatives before 1898. One of these ancestors, my great-great-grandfather, John Thomas Howe, is especially noteworthy here. John Thomas was born on March 9, 1859, 111 years to the day before my older brother Stephen Ward, another great-great-grandson. John Thomas was one of 6 children born to Alfred and Mary Moore Howe, both of whom were born to formerly enslaved black men and their Native American wives. John Thomas had an incredible zest for life, a commitment to service, and accomplished a great deal, becoming one of the many prominent Howe men and women of the 19th century Wilmington. Pictured here are his sister, Mary Washington Howe, who was a celebrated educator in Wilmington, and John Thomas's son, Alfred G. Howe, and his wife, who were my grandmother's parents. Pictured here, which I know you can't see, but I wanted to just reference it for a moment. This is New Hanover County. Is the number of Ku Klux Klan claverings, chapters, by county in 1966, about 80 years after the coup. North Carolina became, as a state, became a stronghold of the Ku Klux Klan, and Wilmington and northern New Hanover were important sites of Ku Klux Klan organization. And we've done some research on this I could talk to you about for a while, but I'm going to get back to John Thomas Howe for a moment. In 1885, at 26 years old, he was working as a mail carrier. In 1889, 4 years later, he worked as a school teacher. And by 1892, at 33 years of age, he was editor of a short-lived newspaper called the Wilmington Weekly Observer. In 1897, just 38 years old, he was serving a one-year term in the North Carolina House of Representatives, where he was involved in several pieces of legislation. One of the reasons I learned all this recently is I was desperately looking for a photograph of him. I didn't find a photograph, but I did find the entire record of the 1897 legislative session and how John Thomas Howe voted on matters. On my computer, something I'm looking forward to getting back to. As we've seen in this powerful film, Wilmington's brief experiment in racial democracy ended violently in 1898, when white racial resentments and anxieties fueled the racial massacre and coup, killing or banishing prominent blacks and white liberal allies. Those who survived and remained in Wilmington or moved elsewhere were undoubtedly affected in ways that we are only beginning to understand. My great-great-grandfather and others in our kinship network were among those who have been affected. In his remarkable book, Strength Through Struggle, providing rich biographical sketches of black Wilmingtonians and historical analysis of their lost city, William Reeves writes, quote, "The year 1898 was a busy one for John Thomas Howe." This is an understatement if there ever was one, but it was indeed incredibly busy for John Thomas that year. Tragically, on January 1st of 1898, John Thomas served on a committee making arrangements for the Emancipation Day celebration in Wilmington. Not knowing how black freedom would be assailed by a white supremacist massacre and coup only months after the event. On February 8th, he was appointed night mailing clerk by the postmaster. His duties to begin March 1st. On June 29, he was appointed storekeeper of a government-controlled distillery. He worked for a short period of time. And on September 23rd, he was a traveling agent for the Daily Record newspaper, working for Alex Manley. The Daily Record published a provocative editorial response to the white supremacist Rebecca Felton roughly 1 month before John Thomas became an agent for the paper. He must have found that work representing the Daily Record a month after this editorial incredibly difficult, in part because he was a recent Black Republican office holder in a state that was organizing against Black political representation, Black economic achievement, Black equality. John Thomas and his cousin, John Harris Howe, were both members of the Committee of Colored Citizens that was summoned to hear the demands of Waddell's committee November 9, 1898. The Wilmington Massacre and coup erupted the following day, less than a year after John Thomas had faithfully served in the state legislature and 2 months after he began working for the paper. Love and Charity Hall, where the press had been temporarily located, the building that was burned there, Love and Charity Hall, was the first place the mob went, as we've seen. And though they destroyed that building and all that it symbolized, the Howes managed to survive and remain in the city, their status dramatically diminished. I also want to mention another ancestor now, Valentine Howe, who was one of the leaders of the Black fire departments in Wilmington that were prevented from putting out the fire at Love and Charity Hall, an incredibly symbolic situation where Love and Charity Hall was required to burn. We've not determined yet how John Thomas or other Howe family members then and since were affected by these events. We've not determined that fully, of course, but there certainly were losses and costs, even if they were not killed. The Wilmington City Directory for 1900 listed now 41-year-old John Thomas as a laborer, suggesting an incredible decline in social, economic, and political standing. And this is to the point that Will Darity makes in the film about occupational status scores. My ancestors were some of the data points in those studies. He was roughly my age at this point in his life, and so much of what he and his family had achieved and built was lost or diminished by the violence of white supremacism, temporarily at least. I also want to note that John Thomas and his wife Aurelia and their children moved to Washington, D.C. by 1910 and managed to rebuild a good life there, working for the federal government, where John Thomas became a clerk in the Treasury Department. Meanwhile, Wilmington's once uniquely representative government was displaced. The leader of the coup became mayor, and many of the paramilitaries who had carried out the massacre were sworn in as police officers. Here, the racial terror was continued, now under the color of law. The once most progressive southern city was rebranded the capital of white supremacy, inspiring the violent reign of Jim Crow segregation that endured for over a half century, with legacy still today. But what came of those who were not able to relocate, or who were forced to migrate, as some of the many thousands of Black refugees fleeing racial terror in the first half of the 20th century? And particularly what happened to those of more modest means, the folks who hid for weeks in the cemetery? What were their lives like after that? How were these people impacted, their children, their grandchildren, and their great-great-grandchildren by this historical racial violence? What imprint have these events left in our social structures today? I want to put Wilmington in context now and point out how many of these events there are in American history. And I'm only going to look at a relatively brief window of time between 1963 and 1917. The first being the draft riots in New York City, where In each of these events, there will be debates around the number of people killed, but in every case, the number of people affected is always vastly greater. The impact on the population cannot be measured, should not be measured by death, as important as those figures are. In the New York draft riot, there were at least 1,000 black refugees driven from New York City. Many of them desperately fleeing the violence, leaving whatever they owned behind. Some of them fleeing, leaving their property, the possessions, their material possessions, their properties they may have owned behind, running literally for their lives. In 1869, and again I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, the Jackson County War in northern Florida displaced unknown number of refugees. Sources list the number as simply hundreds of African Americans again fleeing this situation. Where did they go? What came of them? In 1892, Memphis, Tennessee lynching that drove Ida B. Wells to initiate her crusade against lynching resulted in at least 6,000 African Americans fleeing as refugees in their own land. When we talk about this, when we talk about things like the Great Migration, we talk about this in general terms, African Americans moving north to flee the violence of the South. But one of the points I want to make today is that we have an improving ability to be more specific with these understandings, to understand exactly where these events occurred and where populations were displaced and where some of the economic and political and social costs are concentrated, where they're dispersing from. A series of pogroms in Missouri are interesting here. The Monette, Missouri pogrom of 1894, resulting in 100 refugees, probably looks like a small number compared to these others, but this was the entire black population of the city. The city became an all-white sundown town as a result of this event. Many of these folks fleeing this city moved to nearby communities that I'll mention in a moment. Spring Valley, Illinois, Wilmington, Pierce City, a city nearby Monette, in the southwest corner of the state of Missouri, where many of those displaced folks fled to, itself became the site of a pogrom, resulting in the dislocation of over 300 African Americans. In that case, roughly half of the black population of the city gone. And with them, all manner of measures of well-being, economic, political, psychological costs. Joplin, Missouri, another nearby town, the southwest corner of Missouri. What came of them and their descendants? Atlanta, Georgia, hundreds of refugees. Springfield, Illinois and Missouri. Springfield also neighboring one of these southwest Missouri communities of concentrated histories of racial violence. The Slocum, Texas massacre. These events are occurring all around the United States. The Forsyth County pogrom of 1,000 refugees. The East St. Louis event, which is one of the most incredible events of racial terror in American history, which has undoubtedly left just an incredible mark, not only in the Black American experience, but on the national character, the national identity, in certainly this region of the country where we are today. And I mentioned this is a brief list. This list could go on for pages and pages. I haven't even gotten to the 1960s, 1940s, 50s, and 60s. The Tulsa pogrom is estimated to have displaced 12,000 African Americans. So we have to acknowledge the effects, but we shouldn't just say, well, there were effects. We need to really come to terms with what these effects have been and how they continue to affect us, how they continue to affect our political culture, our relationships with each other. Things like violence in our communities still today. So I'm going to talk more about that in my remarks. This is a map from a project I'm going to describe today, which is called the Racial Violence Archive, where I've been working with teams of students for the last several years to try to collect as much data as we can on the history of racial violence in this country, race-related political violence so that we can analyze it more systematically and make sense of what some of these legacies are and what the implications are for remedy. This is a snapshot of northern Florida where I mentioned the Jackson County War was up here in Jackson County, Florida. The city of Marianna, Florida is the county seat. Jackson County has an incredibly violent racial history, beginning, as far as we know, I'm sure it goes back farther, with the Jackson County War of 1869, where Confederate veterans formed one of the early chapters of the Ku Klux Klan and proceeded just a few years into the Reconstruction era to violently remove the Reconstruction government of Jackson, based in Jackson County, Florida. This is an event very much like the Wilmington Massacre and coup that occurred decades earlier. And in this case, they killed 150 white and black Republicans who were, I have to always point out, the progressives of the day, it's confusing. But the white and black Republicans, 150 of them killed, unknown numbers banished from this community. And in 1900, Jackson County petitioned the state of Florida to establish its juvenile reformatory in Marianna. The state of Florida decided that that would be a fine place for a reformatory to be located for the state. The Florida Reform School for Boys opened in 1900 in Marianna, Florida. They remained open until 2011. We'll come back to 2011 in a moment, but first I want to point out that that Jackson County was the site of at least 7 lynchings between 1900 and 1934. The first 30 years of the history of the reform school in this small town saw at least 7 lynchings in that community. The event in 1934, widely regarded as the most sadistic lynching in American history, the lynching of Claude Neal, who was killed by a mob and then dragged through town, hung in the courthouse square, his body mutilated by men, women, and children. It's estimated thousands of people came to view the lynching, which had been planned well in advance. People came from 11 nearby states to participate in this mob action. It's alleged that white children were given sharpened sticks to participate in the mutilation of his corpse. His toes, his fingers, other body parts were removed. It was a horrific ordeal that undoubtedly involved, either then or later, people who would be tied to the reformatory in Marianna. This was one of the biggest industries in that community. This is a picture, you can't see it to the right, this is a picture of what was called the black side of the Florida School for Boys, later renamed Dozier after one of its superintendents of many years. And like many juvenile institutions, as I write about in my book, The Black Child Savers, this was organized as an explicitly segregated institution where African-American children were very explicitly subject to a labor extraction regime. In fact, the reason Jackson County petitioned for the reformatory is they wanted to replace their labor force lost by emancipation. They wanted a new supply of exploitable labor and found it in juvenile wards of the state who were committed to this institution. And what the records show from Dozier is that black children in particular were subject to brutal work conditions. Many of them suffered, we know from the published records, suffered from the exploitation of their labor and other violence at the institution, racialized and sexualized violence. Allegations dogged this institution throughout its over 100-year history. What we only learned in 2011, when the property was, the institution was finally closed, and the property was going to be sold to developers, is that dozens of bodies lay in unmarked graves on the grounds of the Florida School for Boys. Now, a team at University of Southern Florida has been excavating these remains and studying who these people were. We know that they were disproportionately African-American children. We also know that the black children found were younger on average than the white children's corpses found, meaning that black children at much younger ages were subjected to lethal violence in this institution. And these people's parents have been told that their children escaped, disappeared. We don't know what happened to them. Now this is a place that I mentioned has a horrible history of racial violence that is running over a century, beginning at least in the war, the Jackson County War, continuing to this day, where today folks are meeting in Jackson County and elsewhere in Florida trying to figure out what do we do to go forward? How do we achieve some kind of reconciliation? What should we do with these remains? I recently wrote a piece on in Wisconsin Law Review titled Microclimates of Racial Meaning, where I've been trying to develop the idea that we should think of these environments as sort of distinct in the way we think of microclimates being distinct for the cultivation of various kinds of crops. You know, we use the term microclimates to talk about whether the conditions are ripe or not for the cultivation of a grape to make a particular kind of wine. But we could also think about microclimates as being more or less supportive of black life, historically and today, as I'll stress as we go forward. But again here, while we should be concerned about these deaths, these unmarked graves, we should be at least equally concerned, I think somewhat more concerned, with those folks who technically survived. These are two men who had been institutionalized at Dozier. What have been the effects in their lives and in the lives of people attached to them? What are the haunting legacies, to use Gabriel Schwab's term, of the racial violence, the sexual violence, the exploitation that occurred at this institution? And how did that play out over generations? This is a juvenile reformatory that operated for over 100 years, meaning you had generations of children passing through that institution, returning to their own communities. Some staying in Florida, others moving to other parts of the country. What are the legacies that we should be attempting to remedy? Gabriel Schwab writes on the importance of reconciling traumatic histories, quote, "Unless trauma is worked through and integrated, it will be passed on to the next generation. If this happens, the next generation will inherit the psychic substance of the previous generation and display symptoms that do not emerge from their own individual experience, but from a parent's, a relative's, or a community's psychic conflicts, traumata, or secrets. It is as if we become," she says, "haunted by the ghosts or the unfinished business of a previous generation." If Melba and I were sitting together watching this powerful film, we kept talking about how relevant these events, the propaganda of the press, the manipulations of the real estate market, how reminiscent they are of our present ordeal today. I don't think there's any doubt that we're haunted by the ghosts of the Wilmington racial massacre and coup. Not only my own family, but all of us collectively. And I want to stress at this point that we have to be equally attentive to how whites are affected by these histories, because that's a part of the collective imprint of these events. I'll give you one example before I move on from Florida. When the reform school closed in 2011, the staff of this county agency was reassigned to other departments in the county. And one man in particular became a former white official of the institution, became a teacher in Mariana school system. And he was a teacher until parents complained that he was teaching children in his class that President Obama's slogan, change, was an acronym that stood for, "Can you help a nigger get elected?" This is in 2012. In the place that became a Ku Klux Klan stronghold in 1869. So we like to think we're through with the past. We want to think we're through with the past. Certainly we wish we could be through with the past, but the past is not through with us. We have more and more evidence of the continuing significance of historical racial violence from systematic research in the social sciences. And I'm going to just share with you quickly what a few of these studies have found, including studies I've been a part of, about the legacies of historical racial violence. And almost all of these focus on lynching as a background event that is predictive of contemporary conflict and violence. These studies show that white supremacist mobilization is higher in places, I showed you the map from North Carolina, in communities that have histories of lynching, net of other factors. So once you take account of poverty levels or whether there was a civil rights movement in the area, etc., studies have found that whether there had been lynchings in a place is predictive of whether white supremacist mobilization is pronounced in that area. This has been shown for the 1960s period in a paper I wrote with Peter Owens and some others, and it's been shown in the contemporary period that white nationalism is more pronounced in areas with histories of racial violence today. We know that racial residential segregation is elevated in these places. We know that death penalty policy support, now these are all multivariate statistical analyses that are saying once you take account of a number of other factors likely to be relevant to this outcome, is a history of lynching important? And all of these studies find that it is. Hate crime levels and hate crime law enforcement are affected. There's more hate crime in communities with histories of racial violence than in communities without those histories. And there's less vigorous hate crime law enforcement in those places with histories of racial violence. Black victim homicide rates, an outcome I'm going to talk more about today, has been shown in a number of studies to be predicted by, that's contemporary black victim homicide rates, the vast majority of which involves black perpetrators. Interracial homicide is very rare. Most crime is intraracial. Has been shown to be predicted by histories of racial violence. Incarceration and capital punishment rates today predicted by histories of racial violence, net of other factors. Corporal punishment in southern schools, another study I'm going to share more with you about in a moment, predicted by histories of racial violence. For each additional lynching in a county, the odds that a child will be subject to corporal punishment increases significantly. And those effects, you won't be surprised to hear, are more pronounced for black children in these school systems with histories, cited in places with histories of racial violence. So when people talk about there being a legacy, or that, you know, there's a sort of, pollution of our environment related to the history of racial violence, it's not just rhetorical. We have a growing body of evidence showing that that is in fact the case, and more evidence of exactly how it works. I'll give you an example of one of these studies that explain kind of how to make sense of this, what are the mechanisms connecting the past and present. This is a study that was looking at homicide, and they basically argued that historic lynching has an effect on the culture of a community. A culture, on the one hand, related to support for violence as a means of resolving dispute in that place, and also an effect related to attitudes about law, legal institutions as a reliable sort of source of dispute resolution. In this study, they describe a brutalization effect for whites, where whites become desensitized to violent means of dispute resolution, and a self-help adaptation among blacks, where blacks living in communities where they've been both subject to violence and denied legal protection and recourse, take it upon themselves to resolve conflicts rather than entrust the state to intervene. Both of these contribute to a culture of violence in a community and to legal cynicism. Legal cynicism is regarded as one of the most important explanations for homicide in our country. Essentially, that people are distrustful of legal institutions and therefore act as judge and jury themselves. This results then, over time, in elevated rates of violence that persist to this day, net of other factors that are important also in understanding homicide. So obviously, contemporary homicide is not only a factor, only affected by histories of lynching, but histories of lynching, other racial violence have been shown to be predictive through these effects of brutalization and self-help adaptation. Importantly, as I mentioned, this effect has only been found for Black victim homicide consistently, and in this earlier study, there was an effect for interracial homicide, although we haven't been able to replicate that finding in our own analysis. So quickly, what are some of the other ways we think this legacy works? I think this is important to think about because it has implications for remedies. If you understand how it's working, you can have a better idea of what we might do to intervene. And a number of arguments have been made about the connective thread between the racial violence of the past and violence conflict today. One is that in these places like Jackson County, you have what researchers have called extreme racial socialization. Race matters in the United States, but it really matters in these places. The meaning people attach to race in these places is elevated, has been over time. Each generation is essentially socialized into an understanding that race matters. You know, when Jeff Sessions' father said, I'm the racist. He's not racist. Many of us thought that was ridiculous, in part because we know of the role of the family in the socialization of children. And so these are environments where racist socialization and extreme racial socialization among everyone is pronounced. More violent subcultures, as I've described, increasingly there's cynicism. The loss of collective efficacy, which is basically a term used to describe our willingness, our inclination to work together to resolve problems that we face, to entrust one another, to cooperate with one another in promoting collective well-being. That willingness to cooperate, that inclination to work together is diminished in these environments with pronounced histories of racial violence. Material dispossession that we've heard a lot about in the film Wilmington on Fire, that occurs in all these contexts of, for example, pogroms, where you have thousands of people leaving with only what they can carry in their arms. That has lasting effects in terms of material wealth, not only in terms of the disaccumulation of wealth by some people, but also differential accumulation. That wealth lost was, as we saw in Wilmington on Fire, gained by others, contributing to the incredible wealth inequality in our country today. And the idea of intergenerational trauma, which I talked about briefly, as the way we inherit the psychic substance of the past that's not been worked through, not been processed. You know, we don't talk about it. You know, my family, one of the reasons Stephen and I don't really know this history of our family in Wilmington is our family never talked about it. We stumbled upon it. And you know, I'm 45 years old. I stumbled upon it last week. Some of the details that are relevant to work I've been doing professionally. It's remarkable. We don't process the trauma. We don't work through it, and that's also understood to be a mechanism contributing to its lasting meaning. And finally, sustained racial violence, which I'll mention a little bit more in a moment. So, I've been developing this racial violence archive project in an effort to really advance not only research in this area, but education, not only academic education, but public education, and ultimately advocacy around this issue of historical racial violence, its legacy and remedy. This is a picture from of the racial violence archive data from North Carolina, New Hanover County here, showing, now this says there were 5 to 10 events in there. One of those events is the 1898 racial massacre and coup. So the people affected by these events are almost impossible to measure. But we're looking at how these events are distributed across place and what the legacies of those events are and what might be done to remedy these issues. It's a collaborative project I mentioned, both to collect records of race-related violence, racial-related political violence since the end of Reconstruction, but also hopefully to collect records on reconciliation efforts. The Equal Justice Initiative, for example, Brian Stevenson's organization, is doing incredible work right now to facilitate racial reconciliation in communities around the country. I think it's important to keep a record of those events. What happened? So that we can make sense of whether, in fact, they have the desired impact of breaking these cycles of let's say, intergenerational trauma, or reducing the legacy effects of historical racial violence. We won't know that if we don't keep a record of what, in fact, is being done in those places that have these histories to intervene in. More broadly, I'm hoping that the work will advance research. I mean, just want to mention about the research part. We're designing this as a web-based digital archive, so that any one of you, for example, could go online, look at the data, look at a place, learn about event histories, but also discover where we are missing information, or where the information is inaccurate, or lacks detail that would be useful. And so a member of the public could go on, or a school, a class project could pick up a study of a particular community, like Wayne County, and say, hey, here are 10 events we found that should be in this record, and here are some records to support, some newspaper articles and photographs to support that. That's beneficial as a research exercise in terms of producing a more accurate collection of data, but it's also, I think, beneficial as a civic exercise to engage the populace in the reckoning work that this reconciliation essentially will require. And all of this should have some value ultimately to advocacy efforts, and I'll talk about one example of that in my conclusion today. I should stress here, I mentioned Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching crusade, and I want to stress here that the Racial Violence Archive project I'm developing is really an extension of what has been a continuous effort, particularly among African Americans, to keep records of the racial terror that has been common throughout American history. And Ida B. Wells should be credited with initiating that effort, with her first publication, Southern Floors, and then her publication of Red Record in 1895, which was the earliest analysis of lynching data. Every chance I get, I tell people Ida B. Wells was the first criminologist. And people look at me like I'm crazy. Well, she didn't have a degree. But if you look at Red Record and some of her other work, you'll see that she systematically analyzed data on lynching to prove the propaganda, to prove that the narrative about lynching as a response, a legitimate response to black sexual violence, was pure propaganda, but it was simply not true. And she used the voices of white journalists who were writing about lynchings and why they were happening to make her point. They were writing time and time again that a person was lynched because they violated racial etiquette. They didn't step off the sidewalk, or they were succeeding too well. One lynching was reported in the paper for, quote, no reason at all. And so Ida B. Wells held these truths up to the public and said, this is the reality of lynching in this country, and it became a powerful resource in her and others' crusade against lynching. I mentioned this has been an ongoing effort to collect these data, just to demonstrate that point. In terms of lynching in particular, there have been a number of efforts to gather lynching data and to leverage these data. And let's talk a little bit more about the work of Tuskegee here. The Tuskegee's lynching report, initiated by black sociologist named Monroe Work in 1912, became a crucial source of information on lynching, and also a very powerful political weapon in the anti-lynching movement. The NAACP soon after began producing a lynching report. Others, like Arthur Raper, produced studies of lynching. The tragedy of lynching is an important study because it really drew a lot of attention to the role of law enforcement in the failure of law enforcement in the case of lynching. But even beyond lynching, we have important examples like Charles Chestnut's novel, which I wanted to mention, and I would associate here with Chris Everett's film. Creative works of documentation that also bring this record to fore. So it's not just databases or counts of events, but the number of ways people have made these histories legible to us and put them before us so that we might confront and deal with them. the Civil Rights Congress in 1951 filed a petition titled "We Charge Genocide," submitted that to the United Nations, accusing the United States of the crime of genocide, listing at least in a section titled "The Evidence" over 500 events of racial violence in the years 1946 to 1950 alone. Much of it implicating police, and a lot of it uniquely, as these records are concerned, a lot of it in the urban north. The American Friends Services Committee published a very important compilation of racial violence events targeting civil rights movement activists in the South. And those organizations themselves, like COFO, produced their own records for their own purposes. In the case of COFO, they maintain call centers where activists in the field were instructed to call in case they were in trouble. They were subject to an attack, they were being chased by police, what have you. They maintained logs of these calls that we found in the archives in Jackson, Mississippi, and used to develop our data on historical racial violence. Amani Claiborne is a black journalist, produced a fascinating newsletter, just a deeply disturbing newsletter that he started in 1981, not intending to do this work, but he was traveling across the South and he kept encountering folks who were sharing with him stories. You know, a police officer shot this man the other day and nothing happened. Or someone was beaten for voting. This is in the 1980s. Monty Claiborne decided that he would make an effort to systematically record these events and make them visible to the nation so that something might be done about this. Records of black church burnings have been produced that contribute to our collective body of knowledge about the history of racial violence. So what the Racial Violence Archive has done in effect is compile these compilations, extract from all these sources records of racial violence, organize them together, and look for patterns, and then supplement that with state-level case studies, where we descend on the state, like so far we've done this in Mississippi, Louisiana, and North Carolina, and we go through archival materials to try to find more event information that would have been missed in these records, trying to produce as comprehensive an account as we can. That work is, of course, very difficult to do for a number of reasons, the main one being just the incredible volume of racial violence in our history. It's impossible to produce a comprehensive record of racial violence, in part because of simply how much of it there has been and how poorly documented it has been. And if you consider for a moment the array of manifestations of racial violence, from the extremely subtle forms like racial microaggressions or racist jokes that are sort of forms of cultural violence. I mean, racial microaggressions are powerful in part because people aren't really clear if anything happened. So how could you systematically measure those kinds of events? You simply can't. Compare that with something like lynching, and you get a sense of why people have focused so much on lynching as the historical racial violence that we might use to analyze these relationships systematically. But there are other possibilities that have yet to be exploited, like the study of these pogroms I mentioned, that haven't been really looked at systematically in terms of their effects. This telegram from Walter Wright, Secretary of the NAACP. Walter Wright, by the way, because he looked like a white man, was able to go into southern communities and investigate lynchings. He was chased out of many communities once it was learned that he was Walter Wright from the NAACP, not actually white. But he was able to infiltrate these communities and give details on lynchings that were then reported in the NAACP's reports. In 1940, the NAACP was outraged by the Tuskegee report claiming that there had been no lynchings in the first part of that year. Walter Wright fired off this telegram saying that that they were inexpressibly shocked by this statement, and that the statement had undermined efforts to pressure the Congress to pass federal anti-lynching legislation. In fact, the white press seized on this discrepancy in the two reports that year to say that Tuskegee and the NAACP don't know how many lynchings there were. One of them says none, one of them says 3. Why should anyone pay attention to these lynching reports? But what they decided to do was get together and agree on what a lynching would be, what they would count as a lynching. They agreed on definition. They had a meeting at Tuskegee. President Patterson organized that brought civil rights lawyers and black journalists and representatives of the NAACP and others to come together to come to some common understanding of what they would measure as a lynching and report collectively as a lynching so as to avoid these political mishaps. So the issue of definition and measurement has always been a problem in these issues, even in the case of the extreme case of lynching. But there are so many events that we simply cannot capture in these records, and I've shared this photo with you to illustrate one such event. In 1948, the Ku Klux Klan in Augusta, Georgia was attempting to improve its image by distributing Christmas boxes to the needy in full regalia. Now, you see this African-American man, probably a tenant farmer here. He's in his home, and the Klan shows up posing for a photograph. The man is duly accepting the gift, not wanting to, obviously, this is a threatening situation, aside from the Klan's intention of improving their image. This man is terrified, and probably would have been more terrified had he known that the welfare department for the city provided the Klan with a list of the names of residents who were needy. This man was probably wondering, why are they here at my house with a Christmas box? But the point I want to make about this image is that this was a moment of racial terror that we simply cannot capture systematically today. These moments were so ubiquitous that they defy our measurement. And yet, as I showed you in that series of studies, by just measuring lynchings, we see statistical evidence of a legacy effect of historical racial violence in these communities. Monroe work was, from Tuskegee, was very conservative in terms of how he thought lynching data should be used. He was a believer in the impact of plain facts. The facts speak for themselves. The facts will set you free, he used to say. And so they would distribute the facts unadulterated. They would produce, for example, they produced this map showing lynchings between 1900 and 1931 distributed by counties around the country, similar to the map I shared with you. Other users of lynching data were less constrained. This is a map, from the Associated Black Press, announcing that the Lynching League has opened. A new season has begun. In 1932, Texas is scored first. And they report a lynching here, and they're using this to shame state governments and local officials. And as I mentioned before, these data became, in fact, politically effective. They were not effective in forcing the passage of anti-lynching legislation, as was desired, was the main objective. But they were effective in pressuring local governments who did not want to be named in the lynching report, did not want to be listed high up in the lynching season table as being leading the lynching league. And so the governors would put pressure on local law enforcement officials to prevent lynchings. They would mobilize National Guard to protect people who they expected would be at risk of lynching, largely because they wanted to attract business to their communities. The economic situation in these communities was desperate, and they did not want to be shamed, but they didn't want to be shamed by the records of the anti-lynching movements, by the records of racial violence that were being mobilized politically. The final lynching reports of the Tuskegee issue in 1952 and 53 reported no lynchings, that attempted lynchings had been averted, most often by law enforcement and National Guard. But more importantly, they announced the need for a new index to race relations, because though lynching was in decline by this point, other kinds of extralegal violence, such as police violence, bombings and arsons, beatings of activists, economic reprisals, which were functionally equivalent to lynching as terroristic means of social control, continued unabated. They had in mind events like these. This is from early 1960s Birmingham, Alabama, where assumed as a peaceful protester, or maybe just black woman walking down the sidewalk is being attacked by this man with a bat. This was not a lynching. This wouldn't have been counted as a lynching before. And yet, it was an event of racial terror. And if you think about the effect, think also not about only the victim and the perpetrator, but think about these folks here, these bystanders, some of them I'm sure participants in ways we can't gather from this picture, and how this event would have had a legacy in their lives and in the community. So in our essentially effort to extend the red record, along the lines that Tuskegee itself had encouraged in 1953 to produce a more detailed account of historical racial violence, not only records of lynching, but records of, for example, Civil Rights Movement era racial violence, we've been able to build a more comprehensive record of events and begin to analyze those events. And right now, we've only systematically done this for North Carolina and Mississippi. But as events have unfolded over the last few years, I made an effort to gather data in Missouri, in the wake of Ferguson, for example. We've also begun looking, after I learned about Dozier, I mentioned the Reform School in Mariana, I began looking more closely at Florida. I had a graduate student from Louisiana, a young white woman who began the quarter with me at University of California, Irvine. She was in my race class, undergraduate class. She pronounced that she was post-racial, that in fact America was post-racial. And by the end of the class, she became committed to working with me on this project, looking at historical racial violence in her own state of Louisiana, where she was shocked to learn about some of the history of the school she went to, the high school she went to, and the community she grew up in. And that some of her family friends were implicated in these histories of racial violence. So this collection has grown, and one of the first things we looked at is whether the effect of lynching on homicide is related, whether Civil Rights Movement era racial violence helps to make sense of that effect. One of the problems with the lynching studies is that they fly over. Lynchings declined dramatically in the early decades of the 20th century. There were still lynchings, but lynching events were really concentrated around 1900, 1910. And then studies fly over the incredibly racially violent mid-20th century and looking at contemporary effects. So we asked whether Civil Rights Movement era racial violence was itself predicted. Violence between 1955 and 75 in these two states was reflected, itself reflected the history of lynching. Was it influenced by histories of lynching? And did it, and how does it relate to contemporary homicide? And we found, in fact, that lynching did predict in Mississippi and North Carolina Civil Rights Movement era racial violence. So in communities with histories of lynching, the likelihood of violence around the Civil Rights Movement was elevated. Lynching still in our study, had a direct effect on contemporary black victim homicide in these two states. So in counties in Mississippi and North Carolina with histories of lynching, the frequency of black victim homicide is elevated, net of other factors related to homicide. But the effect of lynching was also occurring through its prior effect on Civil Rights Movement era violence, and this effect was stronger. So, statistically stronger. So, in other words, in those places where the legacy of lynching was reinforced by subsequent racial violence and sustained sort of pattern of racial violence, where the soil has been continually cultivated to support racialized violence, the relationship to black victim homicide was even greater. We thought that was somewhat encouraging finding because it suggests that if we are in fact vigorous in our efforts to intervene in these communities with histories of pronounced racial violence, and we can identify these what I call microclimates of racial meaning, these hotspots, to use criminologist's term, of racial violence. If we're committed to that work, we might in fact reduce the legacies, the effects of historical racial violence. The film talked a little bit about reparations, a good deal about reparations, and I certainly support reparations, but I think as we think about intervening and repairing, we have to think about also these kinds of effects. This is not about monetary distribution. How do we reduce the threats to black life chances today in the form of homicide in these communities that have histories of racial violence? It raises a different set of questions. But that's not the only kind of violence we should be concerned about. I'm going to end on this note. You may be surprised to know that 19 states continue to permit corporal punishment in public schools. The United Nations regards corporal punishment as a human rights violation. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child has pressured member nations to banish the use of corporal punishment in all settings. The United States is the only nation now, before it was the United States and Sudan, but Sudan became a signatory. The United States is the only nation that is not a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Wow.
Now, many states have their own accord outlawed corporal punishment in schools at least. And you see those states here, they're blue. 0% practice of corporal punishment in schools. This is around 2011. The states that are not blue legally allow corporal punishment, but the vast majority don't use it, or use it incredibly infrequently. The only states that frequently use corporal punishment, that is 50% or more of schools in the state report using corporal punishment, are these dark red states: Arkansas, Mississippi, and Alabama. Now, given the broad condemnation of corporal punishment internationally and nationally, every professional association, the American Association of Pediatrics, of Psychology, of Medicine, of Law, has condemned corporal punishment because not only it's not effective, but harmful to children. Given its broad condemnation, its persistence in southern states with histories of racial violence and its racially disparate use, we already know that black children, boys and girls, are disproportionately subjected to corporal punishment, as well as a number of other school disciplinary measures. We thought we should look at whether historic lynching is predictive of the actual use of corporal punishment in states where it remains legal. So we did an analysis of 10 southern states. These 10 states, with histories of both lynching and where corporal punishment remains legal, and we looked at whether the use of corporal punishment in a school was predicted by the history of lynching in the county that the school exists in. And what do you think we found? We found that the number of lynchings in a county has a significantly, and by the way, this wasn't a marginally significant effect. This was a very strong effect in a statistical model. Every additional lynching increases the odds that any child in that school, in that county, will experience corporal punishment. So in other words, the legacy effects of lynching for white children in these school systems. They're more likely to be beaten in schools based in communities with histories of racial violence. And this goes back to the point I was talking about in terms of the brutalization effect. But this lynching effect is stronger for African American kids, where the effect on the odds of receiving corporal punishment was much greater for each additional lynching in the case of black children. Now think about this for a moment. You've got corporal punishment in southern schools in 2012, I studied it in 2012, where we're finding that black children in particular are at greater risk of being beaten by school authorities if they're in a school system based in a community that has a history of racial violence, in a place where, if they're from that community, every generation before them was also at higher risk of being violently assaulted, beaten oftentimes. You know, if we go all the way back to the period of chattel enslavement, very literally at risk of being beaten. In the paper we're writing about this, which will be published sometime this year, we expect, we mentioned how, you know, in my book, The Black Child Savers, I quote North Carolina juvenile court officials who say on record, the most effective means of disciplining a black child is to whip him, because black people are responsive to whipping. This is a 1930s North Carolina juvenile court official. 1901, Alabama officials formally legitimized the whipping of people in the convict lease system on this partially racialized logic that because most of the prisoners that were in that system were African American by far, and because, according to them, whipping was the most effective means of controlling black people, that method should be used in the convict lease system. Here we are in the 21st century where that same logic seems to be pervasive in complicated ways. We can talk about maybe more in Q&A. But let me just conclude by saying that I believe that it's possible for us to achieve something like transitional justice or transformative racial justice, where we might in fact free our political culture, our behavior, our relationships from the trappings of the past. But I agree that this is only possible if we confront one another and move toward reconciliation. This is a point that Ida B. Wells made in her anti-lynching work. That the only way to right wrongs is to cast a light of truth upon them. This is a point that's being made right now in Ferguson with its truth-telling project. This is the logo for the truth-telling project in Ferguson, Missouri, right now. And this is from a protest in Ferguson, and this woman's face speaks powerfully to the importance of our effort to escape from the trappings of the past. She's tired of protesting. We're all tired of protesting racial injustice. And I think that we won't stop having to protest these injustices until we come to terms with the historical racial violence that's so powerfully documented in Wilmington on Fire. I want to close by saying, people will say you can't change the past, and obviously that's true. But what we can do, and I think we should therefore strive to do very diligently, is transform the meaning of the past in our communities today. Thank you very much.
This is the most important part of our programming, is to actually have a conversation with our scholars. We'll take a few questions. Any of those who would like to purchase books, if you're leaving, can you see me, please? And after we do the Q&A, we'll bring the books and merchandise out to the table. Any questions, please, or comments?
I was wondering, do you guys contemplate what a Wilmington would look like now in 2017, based upon all the information that you have observed and studied?
I would, I've been going to Wilmington, I guess, for the past 5 years. I'm from Laurinburg, North Carolina, and it's about an hour and a half from Wilmington. So the city, like back then, before the massacre happened, it was North Carolina's largest city. I would say it would be like how Charlotte is today. A lot of people may be familiar with Charlotte more than Wilmington, but I would probably, it probably would be just like Charlotte or bigger, because of, the port activity that was going on and this migration of a lot of African Americans coming to the city for economic prosperity and stuff like that. So I would suggest it would have been like how Charlotte is today in North Carolina, but the city was just stunning. The growth of the city was stunning because of the massacre. And it didn't really benefit a lot of the white community as well. Because when you go to Wilmington today, it's mostly made up of poor whites. So even with this massacre, it still didn't benefit the majority of white Americans that are there. So it just didn't, stunt the growth of the black community, but just the community as a whole. The city as a whole was stunted because of the massacre.
I think part of what you're asking is if Wilmington were to happen if the massacre and coup were to happen today, what would that look like? It's hard for me to envision history repeating itself in a very literal way. But no, maybe I'm naive or too hopeful, but I tend to think that on the one hand, black civil society, for example, is too strong, too interconnected nationally and internationally. I think we have, too much, we have strong enough alliances with progressives and liberals of different racial ethnic groups. It's hard to envision a slaughter certainly on a scale, I mean, it's not hard to imagine in some very specific places. And you know, I described these microclimates, for example, you know, small communities like Jackson County, Florida. It's not hard to imagine the number of people being murdered and people being pushed out of office. But you know, what I see happening much more readily is what I write about in this piece, the slow violence of state-organized rape crime. I see the unspectacular violence. You know, not the murders, the bombings, the sort of burning down of properties, but rather the dilution of economic and political power, the dispossession of property through subtle means, the systematic denial of access to quality education that won't literally kill people, but will effectively destroy life chances and therefore group well-being. And that will be pronounced in some places more than others if we're not really diligent in organizing against it. And actually, I meant to mention in my comments, I mean, because I'm here in Detroit, I wanted to say, the Black Child Savers is mostly about how Black civil society organized in opposition to Jim Crow juvenile justice and created its own system of juvenile justice while challenging the white supremacist system, including in places here like Detroit, where the Wayne County system, I know because I studied the contemporary system, is still terrible, but it was terrible in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. And to give you one example of that, the juvenile court authorities in the 1950s were referring to Black children as people of colored foreign nationality. They described essentially Black American as a foreign nationality. This in a context where the juvenile justice system envisioned itself as a manufactory of citizens, as a place where children would be ready for participation in civil society. Black children were painted as foreign nationals. But in the case of Detroit, in particular the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, the alumni chapter of the Delta sorority, organized against the workings of this Jim Crow juvenile justice system here in Wayne County. Although they didn't manage to defeat it, they certainly prevented it from exacting the kind of destruction it intended. And so that's what I meant when I said I think Black civil society is too strong. I think it's there's certainly threats, but I think the kind of wholesale slaughter and loss of standing is unlikely to, at least I hope.
I want to ask the filmmaker, what kinds of plans do you have for distribution, but also national broadcast? Because we use these films in African American studies, Black studies all the time, but as Geoff was saying, it's important for the entire American society to understand what happened to Black people, because a lot of them don't seem to believe. They think that after slavery was over, so what happened? What happened to y'all? Why couldn't you get yourself together? Why every other immigrant group? And this history has been repressed, and it's not, widespread, and it needs to, in this medium in particular, because it's really hard to get folks to read books. But you can possibly, even harder for them to look at some of these kinds of films, but still, to make it more accessible to a broader population.
We currently have plans to, I've been talking to PBS a lot lately. We're going to try to possibly do something by the summer. We start doing some national broadcasting, and also different other channels and media outlets as well. And also I've been pushing towards universities and other places like different museums like the Charles Wright Museum to really push it into their collection as well. We're just trying to push it all over. I have like 6 screenings actually this week for showing the film. I'm actually did a screening a couple of days ago at a college in Greensboro, North Carolina. And, today we're doing this, and I'm flying to LA for the Pan-African Film Festival. Then I go to Savannah to a couple of HBCUs there. So, I'm trying to get it out to many, people as possible. And would like everyone here to tell people about it as well. You know, I think that's what we have to do as a collective of people. Let's spread the message as much as we can. If everyone has social media and everything, tell people about the film.
To interrupt you,
Yeah.
but I was just thinking about University of North Carolina, all of those campuses. Do you have contacts in those institutions?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I've actually had a couple actually purchased this week. Duke University, they purchased a copy. Chapel Hill, UNC Wilmington. So the word is getting around. Finally, you know, but I know it's a process. You know, I don't have like, you know, Oprah Winfrey type of money, but you know, we're still moving. You know, it's coming along.
Send her one too.
Yeah, I will.
She got a TV show.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. You know, if anyone here knows her, you know, let them know. Yeah, we're trying to get it out to as many people as possible.
To the filmmaker, I'm right here in front of you. Right here. I'm sorry. I'm videoing this right now, live streaming on my Facebook page, so I'm doing that part of getting the word out. But what other social medias do you have available so that people can know where you're at? And as far as, you know, to the professor, the same thing. Where can we find this information, because it's very important. I look to the museum for this information because it's important to our children, and so where's your information? How do you see it going forward so that we can keep this going?
Well, everyone in here, you can just go to WilmingtonOnFire.com, the name of the film. WilmingtonOnFire.com has everything on there where you can buy the film, where you can share it, more information on it. If you want to find out more information about different books, they kind of go more in depth about the subject, just go to WilmingtonOnFire.com and everything is on there. And I would just suggest everyone just go on there, and there's all the links to different social media pages that we have going on and everything. So WilmingtonOnFire.com. You know, it's pretty simple, the name of the film. So just type that in.
And for the
Yeah, so in my case, you can go to racialviolencearchive.weebly.com. Weebly is the web provider. And you'll find the map, interactive map I showed pictures of, but you can explore the data we have in the event database. But you can also find there some of the research that I mentioned that we've been doing. You can get direct access to that material. You can get, there are also links to remedial efforts. So there, just mention a few of these. I mean, there are people working on these issues. I mentioned Equal Justice Initiative and what it's doing. But there's a woman who got me involved in this, is a professor named Margaret Burnham, who's a black law professor at Northeastern University, where I was my first faculty job. She runs a clinic called Civil Rights and Restorative Justice, where they're pursuing civil rights era cold cases. These are murder cases where no one is punished, and there's a link to that project. There's information about the Wilmington Commission and its report, which is an incredibly detailed report on the Wilmington. But anyway, that site will become a portal to what we're doing in the project, and I encourage you to visit it and to email me so give people my email address if you want to write any information. Yeah.
what's your email address?
It's gward@uci.edu.